He's heard it all before. You're a pastor. You're not supposed to get political. You shouldn't be talking about these issues, so just stay out of politics and stick to preaching the gospel. Life, marriage, sexuality, borders, ethnicity. These things aren't political. They're biblical. God's word has much to say about the culture we're living in. This is Our Watch with Tim Thompson.
Well, hey, happy Sunday to you. Welcome to Our Watch with Tim Thompson. My name is Jake Porter. I'm the assistant pastor over at 412 Church in Temecula Valley. I want to let you guys know we've got two campuses. We've got one campus out in the Temecula Valley here in Southern California. We also have another campus out in Southern Idaho. That is in the Treasure Valley. So if you find yourself in any one of those areas here in Southern California or out in Southern Idaho, we'd love to have you guys join us. We've got a special message for you guys today. This is going to be a message from Charlie Kirk's pastor, from Pastor Rob McCoy, and he's going to be talking about some things going on in our culture, talking about some opposition that he has had, and it's going to be a great message. So take a listen to this.
Well, if you guys have a Bible, open up to Luke 19, if you would. Luke 19. We're gonna read starting at verse 37. I'll read out loud if you'll follow along silently. Then as Jesus was now drawing near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works that they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." And some of the Pharisees called to him from the crowd, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." But he answered and said to them, "I tell you that if these should keep silent, the stones would immediately cry out." Now, as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, "If you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes." July 4th, 2026, which will be the 250th birthday of our nation. Do you realize how close we were to the absolute loss of this constitutional republic? I don't know if you saw how rapidly evil descended. We witnessed censorship and propaganda in our lifetime. They declared in California the church was non-essential. Violation of the first 16 words of the First Amendment. The abortion clinics were essential. Cannabis distributors were essential. Strip clubs were essential. Liquor stores were essential. But the bride of Christ was non-essential. Charlie Kirk made the worst prediction in radio history. Charlie calls me his pastor. I call him my friend, and I'm his biggest fan. And he made the worst prediction in radio history by his own admission. He said, Governor Mussolini, that's our loving term for him, Governor Mussolini has declared the church non-essential, and he said the church in California will not take that sitting down. He couldn't have been more wrong. They capitulated to tyranny. And they invoke the most quoted verse in the establishment of Nazi Germany that the pastors in Germany invoked to silence any who would stand in opposition to Hitler. And they invoked Romans 13. And I got calls from pastors all over the state saying, "You're in violation of Romans 13. Which basically in a nutshell is God appoints all positions of authority and we're to submit to that authority. At least that's how they'd quote it. And I said, "No, I'm not. You are." It was Jonathan Mayhew, a minister on the Eastern Seaboard prior to the War of Independence, who exegeted Romans 13. And when he exegeted Romans 13, his study was so profound that John Adams, who would go on to be one of the presidents of our country, and as well as Thomas Jefferson, who would go on to be another president of our country, both said that they attributed the War of Independence to Jonathan Mayhew because in his exegetical work of Romans 13, he said that yes, God appoints all positions of authority, but the passage says that those authorities are therefore good. And so he would go on to say, when they cease to do good, they cease to be the authority. You see, Romans 13 is not unlimited submission to tyranny. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Bonhoeffer or read his book or the multiple biographies of Bonhoeffer. A Protestant minister who participated in 2 assassination attempts against Adolf Hitler. He said, if someone is careening a bus to run over children, you will do everything you can to stop it. You'll throw a wrench into the system of the annihilation of 6.5 million Jews. And yet we're to submit to Hitler, Pol Pot, Stalin, to a governor who does have authority, but not in violation of the first 16 words of the First Amendment to declare the church non-essential. And then we went into a season of darkness like I've never seen in this country. We watched as they started mutilating our children. They call it healthcare. They give them hormone blockers that are so brutal and they consider so inhumane that they won't give them to serial rapists in prison, but they'll give them to our children. And if we fail to call them by their pronouns that they've selected, the children will be taken away from us and be placed as wards in the state. In California, we lead the nation in abortion. They don't just rip the baby apart in the womb of the mother and flush its parts into the sewer system of the state. No. We're far more heinous than that in California. We harvest the organs on the downbeat of the heart. We make Nazi Germany look like Girl Scouts. And the church says nothing. And when someone like Pastor Tim stands up, they say, oh, he's too political. And congregants say the same thing. He's too political. Because they're mistaken thinking politics, the word is poly meaning many and ticks meaning blood-sucking parasite. But the definition of the word, listen, comes from the polis, affairs of the city. Jeremiah 29 says, pray for the peace of the city in which you dwell, for in its peace you'll have peace. Jesus, when asked the great commandment, the Shema, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang the law and prophets. Jesus would go on to say, to cause one of these little ones to stumble, it would be better for you to have a millstone tied around your neck and cast in the deepest ocean. You don't love your neighbor as yourself. You allow them to say there's over 100 genders. You usher in confusion and remain silent as the voiceless are carted off to annihilation and obliteration. You stand with the screaming crowds at Black Lives Matter, and they do, but then when Roe v. Wade is overturned, you are silent. You place a black tile, but Roe v. Wade is overturned and you are silent. Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist. She wanted to get rid of what she called the Negro problem. That's why most of the abortion clinics are in inner cities of black communities. The black community in America used to have a 7.6% birth rate. Now it's 1.6. In 20 years, if you don't change that, you will have to go to the Smithsonian Institute to see a black American. It is a holocaust on the black community, and churches were silent. They're hypocritical. They put their finger in the air to see which way the wind is blowing so that they can adapt to the culture instead of drive it. This nation conceived in liberty and dedicated the proposition all men are created equal, not in capacity, but in dignity. It had its 50th birthday, the Jubilee, on July 4th, 1826. Two of its earlier presidents were at contention. They were at odds with each other as they fought over the future of the nation, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. John Adams, up until Reagan, would be the oldest living president in the history of the country. He would be in his 90s, which was a remarkable achievement in those days. And as they're at odds, Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and I believe the Constitution, he's one of the founding fathers. He was an evangelical Christian, loved the Lord, and felt a burden and a vision from God that he was to reconcile these two old friends. And he feverishly worked to reconcile them, and they came to reconciliation and began to correspond once again. These living legends, they made it to the 50th birth date of the nation they helped forge. And both of them died on the same day, July 4th, 1826. It's almost as though God was placing his stamp of approval. War of 1812, Madison, his wife Dolly, James Madison, was the president of the United States, declared war against Great Britain because they were seizing our sailors on the high seas and employing them in the war against France. He tired of it and declared war against Great Britain. They came in with the redcoats and eviscerated our continental forces. Went up to Detroit, overtook that, began to march upon Washington, D.C., at which point they burned the city to the ground. Dolly Madison escaped after her husband had left earlier. She was brave. She stayed. She took the portrait of George Washington and the copy of the Declaration of Independence, the original, and fled the city while they burned our library, all of our records. They burned everything. It was despicable. It brought a curse upon England, the British Empire, because as all the nations watched what they did to America, it nauseated them. So the third largest city remaining in America, Baltimore, they needed to take that, and then they would own this upstart. As the forces burned D.C. and began to march south towards Baltimore, a hurricane descended upon the land, thunderous as though heaven itself had opened up, and they lost more soldiers, the British did, by the hurricane and the thunder and the lightning and the torrential rain than they had lost in the battle for both Detroit and also D.C. It bought time for the American forces to build defenses of Baltimore. They had a seasoned leader that was able to defend the surrounding regions of Baltimore. So the British also decided a two-fronted approach by bringing the entirety of their navy into Baltimore Harbor. And Americans sunk their own ships to block the harbor so the British fleet couldn't come in. They sank their own ships to defend the last city in America. The British didn't care. They had weaponry to destroy Fort McHenry. At the time, Colonel Armistead had commanded Mrs. Pickering to build a flag so big they could see it from the distance. It was the size of this room as they sewed this massive flag together and hoisted it above the fort at McHenry. The British came in. Francis Scott Key, an attorney, had come to release one of the doctors and seek release. He had papers requesting the British fleet because this surgeon had both tended to the American forces and the British forces and wanted to appeal to them to release him. He was successful, but the commander of the British forces, the fleet said, or the admiral of the fleet said, "You must remain here because in the morning there will be no America. We are about to destroy Baltimore and own this nation as our own." And the prisoners down below on the deck were looking up at Francis Scott Key, who stood upon the deck. And as the twilight began to descend, they saw the massive American flag. "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light, what proudly we hailed it, the twilight's last gleaming." When the sun was going down, we saw it then. But oh, say, can you see it now? The massive artillery that descended, they lost, and American forces would come out as it would begin to crack and break. They'd hold it up with their own hands, bodies piled around it, as they just pummeled Fort McHenry. The British fleet finally gave up. American forces staved off the British coming in from the land. And the British realized the citizens of this city aren't giving up. What so proudly we hail. Over the land of the free and the home of the brave. And that day, every one of them knew what it meant to be an American. We were given a season and time and a date. God marked the 50th anniversary of the birth of this nation. But on the 100th, it was sad. 1876 of July 4th, the president was Rutherford B. Hayes, and he had tied in the Electoral College to Tilden, Robert Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes, and they couldn't decide a president. We were in a crisis. The Republicans had gotten great clout by Lincoln. They had dominated the political landscape following the Civil War. But after the corruption of Grant and Johnson and the others, they finally were divided and the South was rising again. The federal forces in the South, the very first Republican senators and Congress members from the South were all black. Black Americans were Republicans until that fateful election of 1826 when they were tied, dead heat. The Democrats were smart and wily, and they convinced Rutherford B. Hayes that they would give him the position of the presidency, the executive branch, as long as he would remove federal forces from the South, which he did. It was basically giving permission for the South to lynch all of the blacks as the KKK would rise, Jim Crow laws would be established, and the obliteration of the conservative black Republicans would be destroyed. They would never forgive them, divided the nation. And then in the 150th anniversary, Calvin Coolidge, a Republican, rose to the ranks, subtle, humble. Many of you don't even know who he is. He was the last president to balance the budget. He was one of the most selfless presidents in the history of the country and turned the course of this country in a direction no one ever expected. But in the 200th anniversary of the country, and I remember it, Carter, double-digit interest rates, hostages in Iran, failed rescue attempts as our helicopters were burning in the deserts of the Middle East, gas stations closed. He was coming on television telling us to put a sweater on and turn the thermostat down, and America's greatest days were behind her. Tragic. And now we come to the 250th anniversary. And you have a president, you don't know what to do with him. We're moving at the speed of Trump. It's just executive order, executive order, executive order, executive order. Panama Bazaars, Gulf of America, Greenland, Canada, 51st state. My son is in the United States Navy. He was ready to give it up, having to teach diversity, equity, and inclusion, critical race theory. They weren't combat ready. Transvestites in the Navy. Just She said, Dad, I just don't recognize this country. He said, Dad, I think I'm going to get out. I said, son, I want to quote you Peter Drucker. He said, the man saw the future that had already happened. He goes, what do you mean, Dad? And I said, this is going to be the 250th anniversary, and every 50-year increment from 50 to 150 to 250 has always been something special in this country, and I think it's following a pattern. And I said, and besides, you saw what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania last week. This is the time of the conversation. I said, son, do you realize that President Trump has only used slides in 4% of his rallies? And he only did it in indoor venues? And when he landed in Butler, Pennsylvania, it was an outdoor venue, and he turned to his staff and he says, get that slide on immigration. They said, Mr. President, it's an outdoor venue. They won't be able to see it. He says, get it. He says, Mr. President, we don't have it. You can just follow this. He said, we don't have it. He says, then find it. And whenever he used the slides, it was always at the end of his bloviating 2-hour, I don't know if you've ever been to a rally, it's like, and he just sticks on something and he's wonderful. It just goes on and on and on. And like pulls his own string. You go, come on. And you've been waiting 3 hours to get in, and then you're sitting through something that you did just like, ugh. And you have to wait till the end to see the slides. But he's demanding this slide 7 minutes into the presentation as a trained marksman, and that shot was 100 meters, a little bit over 100 meters. That shot with anyone who's remotely trained to shoot is like a professional golfer sinking a 1-foot putt. And he's pointed at this portion so it doesn't hit this, it goes out that way and the brains just blow in the soft portion of the skull. 7 minutes in, he calls for the slide and turns to point to it and the bullet hits his ear. It's called the millimeter miracle. I turned to my son and I said, son, that just doesn't happen. So I'd stay in the Navy if I were you. He did. And and I said, son, every 2-star general or admiral and above who said the greatest military threat to America is climate change is going to be gone, trust me. And I'm right, they're gone. Why do I say this? Because as we open the passage of Luke 19, then as he was now drawing near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of disciples, I'm sorry, where were we? Oh, no. Is it the white one? I was reading it. There we go. As he was drawing near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice, saying, for all the mighty works that they had seen, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, which is Hosanna, the song you were singing. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. They're singing Hosanna. And then the response by the Pharisees who were present, they just said in verse 39, some of the Pharisees called to him from the crowd saying, teacher, rebuke your disciples. Tell them to shut up. They're saying, you're the Messiah. He answered and said to them, I tell you that if these should keep silent, the stones would immediately cry out. What kind of an event in the history of the world that if these people didn't declare him king, that the stones would cry out? This has to be a monumental point in time, more than July 4th, 1826, when 2 presidents die on the same day. This has to be a monumental occurrence. And as he drew near the city in verse 41, as he drew near to the city, he saw the city and he wept over it. What would cause him to weep? Saying, if you had known, even you especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of Christ in the midst of conflict. And he's arrived. He's the Prince of Peace, but now they're hidden from your eyes. What is he saying? You see, today is a celebration of one of the most amazing fulfilled prophecies ever. Sir Robert Anderson, who worked for Scotland Yard, a detective, wrote an entire book on this prophecy out of Daniel chapter 9. Let me read this to you. And Daniel 9 is pretty profound. The passage reads in verse 24, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make And weeks for the Israelite means years. It's a period of 7 of any of these. Daniel weeks are years. God is saying there are 70 periods of 7 years where he is going to be doing some amazing things in regards to the Jews. This is an unbelievable prophecy. And he declares it, that it's going to happen at the decree of the rebuilding of the wall. And we find that in Nehemiah chapter 4. In Nehemiah chapter 4, with this declaration by Artaxerxes, the clock begins to tick. Now, 7 weeks and 62 weeks, or 69 weeks, 69 periods of 7 weeks from the time of the command went out to rebuild and restore Jerusalem. So you go 69 times 7. If you have a calculator on your phone, you can do this. 69 times 7 is 483 years. It was a 360-year calendar. So Robert Anderson is doing this, the ancient calendar back then. So it makes 173,880 days from that decree by Artaxerxes, and the clock begins to tick to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah comes. So Nehemiah in Nehemiah 4 received that command 100 years after Daniel's prophecy on March 14th, 445 BC. Now you start ticking. 173,880 times every day. Jesus, long-awaited Messiah of the world, he enters Jerusalem on a donkey to the exact day of the prophecy. He says, had you known this your day, he wept over them. They were not aware of the more sure word of prophecy. They had not studied to show themselves approved. Isaiah says, remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. Isaiah 46, 9 and 10, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. God is God, there is no other. For those of you who are skeptics of Christianity, you would be amazed at the God who speaks beyond time. You're looking at life passing so quickly. You're enamored by the baubles and the trinkets. You're living on a movie set that is about to be taken apart and dismantled. And you're going to breathe your last and step into eternity. And God speaks to you today from the space-time continuum with the anniversary of 173,880 days from the decree given to, this is mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. And he looks at you and he says, had you just known this your day? You know what today is for you? Today is the day of salvation. The Messiah of the world is celebrating the anniversary of the first time he arrived on a prophetic declaration of 173,880 days. And he did it to Daniel. And Daniel was faithful to write it down. And Nehemiah witnessed in chapter 4 the declaration of the rebuilding of the wall. And Christ entered on the exact day, AD 31. God bless you guys.
This has been a production of Our Watch with Tim Thompson. We hope you're encouraged to engage the culture around you. We want to invite you to connect with Pastor Tim by going to the Connect page on ourwatch.com. That's OURWatch.com. Until next time, this is all of us at Our Watch reminding you to be bold, be strong, and to take back the public square.